In order to understand this passage, we need to know something about the background to the church in Philippi at the time Paul wrote this letter. During Paul's secondary missionary journey, Paul went to Philippi, and as there was no Jewish synagogue there, he went to where a group of God-fearing Gentile women were praying. They were converted, and included in this group was a businesswoman named Lydia, and it is in her house that they meet and the church is formed. What this suggests is that the church that developed in Philippi was largely a Gentile church. That is, the members were not Jewish. And this is significant. One of the things that is fundamental to the Christian faith, but also something that we can sometimes forget or ignore, is that Christianity comes out of and is fundamentally related to Judaism. To state the obvious, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus is the long-awaited Jewish Messiah who has come to fulfill all the Old Testament promises and prophecies. As Christians and as Jews, we worship the same God. We worship the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Moses. As we read the book of Acts and look at the church history of the very early church, it is clear that the very early church was distinctly Jewish. We see this not only in the New Testament writings, but also in the fact that the secular authorities saw it as a branch of Judaism rather than something new or different. As Paul went on his missionary journeys, his first choice of a place to preach the gospel in each town was in the Jewish synagogues. The first believers met in the temple in Jerusalem. But Paul had been chosen by God to be an apostle to the Gentiles. This meant that in the churches that he planted, there were people from a Jewish background as well as people from a Gentile background. This meant that a number of these churches had a mixture of Jews and Gentiles who had different belief structures and different social structures. This is where the early church started to have a problem. If Christianity was the fulfillment of Judaism, then what did this mean if you wanted to be a true follower of Christ? Did it mean that you had to follow all the laws and traditions of Judaism? Or was that only for ethnic Jews? The issue particularly showed itself in relation to circumcision, the food laws, and the Sabbath, which were key markers of being a good Jew. This was starting to cause real problems and division in the early church. So Paul and Barnabas go to Jerusalem to meet James and Peter, who were the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, to try and resolve this problem. This became known as the Council of Jerusalem. What they came up with was this agreement. They said that Gentile converts did not have to be circumcised, but that they should observe Jewish prohibitions on meat offered to idols, meat of animals killed by strangling, blood, and sexual immorality. If you were a Jewish Christian, then you could follow the Jewish laws and traditions, but as a Gentile, you did not have to. In theory, this means that the problem was solved. The church leaders have made a decision, and of course everyone is happy to follow it. Well, no. The first century church was no different to the 21st century church, and as you can imagine, there were groups of people who disagreed with that decision. There were groups of so-called Judaizers going round these newly established churches, teaching that in order to be a proper follower of Christ, you had to follow all the rules and traditions of the Torah and the law, including circumcision. For them to be a Christian, you had to follow all the Jewish laws and traditions. A group of these Judaizers had gone to Philippi and were saying to the church that they had to follow the Jewish laws and traditions of circumcision, food laws, and Sabbath. Paul hears about this, and so he writes this part of this letter to the Philippians to address this problem. So that's quite a long introduction to the passage, but we can really only understand the passage and what Paul is saying if we read it against that background. So Paul starts this section by setting out his credentials as someone who was a Jew by birth, someone who had followed all the Jewish laws and traditions. His family heritage goes back to the tribe of Benjamin. He was circumcised according to the law. His family spoke Hebrew. And as a Pharisee, he followed all the laws. And then he'd begun actively persecuting Christians. Paul is saying that he had done everything that is expected of him as a Jew. As far as the law is concerned, he had done everything that was needed. But having met Jesus on the road to Damascus, he now realizes that all of that is completely worthless, because the only thing that is really important is knowing Jesus. Paul came to realize that his problem was not that he could not do what the law required of him as a Jew. It was not that he could not reach the standard required of the law and the traditions. His problem was that after he had achieved that standard, he realized that he was trying to achieve the wrong thing. What he now realizes is that what is all important is faith in Jesus and the righteousness that comes through faith. What Paul is arguing here is that it does not matter if we have been circumcised, it does not matter if we have kept the food laws, it does not matter if we have kept the Sabbath. Paul had done all these things, but now he says these are of no value compared to knowing Jesus. He is making it very clear to the Philippian church that they can reject the teachings of the Judaizers, that as Gentiles they do not need to be circumcised, nor keep the food laws, nor keep the Sabbath, because what is important is knowing Jesus and his resurrection. This mirrors what Paul wrote to the Corinthians when he said, "For I am resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified." What Paul is teaching here is not new. Much of the teachings in the Old Testament are about the importance of faith in God, rather than obeying rules and regulations. If we go back to Genesis 15, we have there recorded that God credited righteousness to Abraham because of his faith. And this example of Abraham is found being used in other New Testament letters. And as we look at the Gospels and the teachings and actions of Jesus, we see his emphasis on faith. If we think about the various healing miracles that we have recorded, how often does Jesus say that the person was healed by their faith and not that they were healed by keeping the law? So how does this relate to us in 21st century Warrington? We are a Gentile church living in a Gentile community. And if we look at the 2021 census data, it suggests there are probably less than a dozen families that have identified themselves as Jewish within Warrington. We do not have the problem that the church in Philippi had. The Church of England does get bogged down in all sorts of arguments, but suggesting that we circumcise babies is fortunately not one of them. One thing that does come out of this passage that I think is applicable to us today is the idea of barriers being put up to prevent people being accepted into the church. What the Judaizers were doing was putting up barriers and boundaries and saying, if you have not done this or that, then you are not a true Christian and not part of the church. They were putting limits on who was acceptable to be part of the church. What Paul was saying is that Jesus has removed all of these barriers. In Christ there is no Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free, and that we should not be putting back up barriers to the gospel or to acceptance into the church. Whilst we are not putting up these Jewish barriers from the law to stop people coming into church, as individual Christians and as a church, what are the barriers that we are putting up that are potentially stopping people coming into church and coming to faith? As a church, I'm sure that we would like to think that we are a welcoming church and that we are not putting up barriers. But I wonder if unconsciously we are putting up barriers. What does our church look like to those who are outside the church? What are the messages that we are sending out to people outside of the church? Are the things that we do, are they not seen as barriers? But the people outside the church do see them as barriers. How do we deal with people who think or act or speak or look different to us? Are we giving the impression that you have to be a certain type of person to be a member of Warrington Parish Church? Are we giving the impression that you have to have a certain type of person to be a member? Are we giving the impression that you have to act and speak in a particular way? Are we giving the impression that you must or must not do certain things? If we are honest, this can be a real challenge. Paul was trying to reconcile Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. The situation had got so bad that some would not take communion together or worship together, and there was a real danger of a split into a Jewish and a Gentile church. Our challenges are different. They also include how do we accept those who are on the margins of society, those with mental health problems, those with additional need. The trans community is a reality in our society, and some will have faith in Jesus. So are we accepting of them? And we're exploring what it means to be a dementia-friendly church and what that looks like for us. Are we putting up barriers because we expect people to meet certain cultural norms, or by the language we use, or the way we dress? Because that is what we think is what a proper Christian does. Are all the things that we say or do helping people to have an encounter with Jesus? Or are they putting up little barriers in the way of people encountering Jesus? Another thing that comes out of this passage that is relevant for us today is that for Paul, knowing Jesus is all-encompassing. It was the be-all and end-all of Paul's life. Whatever Paul had, and from a Jew's perspective, he had everything. He now considers all of that to be as garbage as compared to knowing Jesus. The Greek word that Paul uses here, and in the version, is translated as garbage. It's difficult translating to English as there is no direct equivalent. Other versions translate it as dung, in the sense of excrement. There is a sense that this is not just useless or worthless, but it is worse than that. Paul is deliberately making an extreme comparison. He is saying that he had everything, but now all that he had is worth less than nothing compared to knowing Jesus and having the righteousness that comes from having faith in Jesus. Is that true for us? Is knowing Jesus that all-encompassing driver in our lives? Or do we still hold on to things from our past lives? Elsewhere, Paul talks about us being new creations. We have put off the old life and put on the new life with Christ. But have we really fully put off the old life? In verses 10 and 11, Paul says this: I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his suffering, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. Paul was not interested in whether someone had been circumcised or not. Paul was not concerned about. What Paul was concerned about was that they did know Christ. Did they know the power of his resurrection? And will they be raised from the dead when Jesus returns? Is that true for us? Does that describe us? Or are we more like the Judaizers in Philippi, who are more interested in making sure people followed the rules and did the right thing than experiencing the fullness of life and the resurrection power that comes from knowing Jesus? Paul's arguments won the day, and the Christian church does not impose Jewish law and traditions on believers. But perhaps we should look to ourselves and our church to see if we are in any way putting up barriers to people knowing Jesus and coming into the church.